Hello, Hockey World. Today is Wednesday, January 7th, 2015.
I'm Kevin Allen of USA Today Sports.
I'm Ryan Garner.
And I'm Michael Agello, and this is the Hockey Buzzcast here on Hockeybuzzcast.com. Good afternoon, gentlemen. We had a very busy, interesting night in the NHL last night. The Buffalo Sabres lose another game. Um, seem to be well on their way to reestablishing themselves in the bottom two of the NHL. The Philadelphia Flyers win a game, but Steve Mason apparently has suffered some sort of injury that will be determined later today. But Kevin, I want to start with the two of the top teams in the Eastern Conference last night. Tampa Bay traveling to the Bell Center in Montreal, taking on the Montreal Canadiens, and they win a 4-2 decision. Tyler Johnson, who's got to be, I mean, we've talked about him a few times before on the show. He's been having a really good year, but he's got 17 goals and now I believe 28 assists. I mean, he's having a fantastic year. I mean, you expected that out of Steven Stamkos. I don't know if you expected that out of Tyler Johnson.
No, absolutely. And, we laughed, you and I did before, at the question of whether or not, he could be considered as good as Steven Stamkos. And I still, as I'm sure you do, believe that Stamkos is still the king in Tampa Bay. But Johnson has really exceeded expectations, and I think even exceeded the second level of expectations.
Mm-hmm.
That line is going really well. He's the general on that line, and as I said the other day, like if you're looking at the top American players that were on the 2014 Olympic team and now project ahead to 2016 World Cup, the biggest difference in my mind is that Tyler Johnson has asserted himself as one of the top two centers, if not the best center the Americans have. And, that's been a problem position, as we all know. In the 1990s, that was the strength of the American program. They had Modano and Roenick and LaFontaine and Dougie Weight, and just for fun, Joel Otto to win some big face-offs. And in modern times, the U.S. has been strong on the wing, but had trouble at that center position. So to have a really an unheralded player rise up and grab one of those spots, I think is good for USA Hockey in terms of international competition. And when you watch him play, last season everybody said that, he flew in under the radar. They have to compete against Stamkos. He doesn't get the top checkers, and clearly he still benefits from having Steven Stamkos out there because Stamkos is facing the top pairing defenseman. But everybody knows who Johnson is, and he's still scoring at a very high level. And to me, he's almost symbolic of how strong this Tampa Bay team is. That it goes beyond Stamkos. I mean, Stamkos, in my mind, is a great player. Not probably having as good a year as he would like to have, or the Lightning would like him to have, but still, Johnson, having him around, and younger players like Palat, and the way Hedman is playing. I mean, this is a really, really strong team.
Yeah, I mean, Ben Bishop has played pretty consistently this year. Knock on wood, he's not. Hopefully, for the Lightning's sake, he doesn't have an injury like he did last year. But Ryan, I've always been a critic of the Tampa Bay defense. It's always been their Achilles heel, and this year it hasn't been. I mean, they weathered the loss of Hedman for, I think it was 6 weeks with an injury, and they added Strawman and they added Jason Garrison during the offseason. Really, good additions to that lineup, but they lost Radko Gudas probably for the year. I mean, they said 4 months, so you would assume that means he's not back probably till the second or third round of the playoffs. And although being an unheralded guy, he's a tough defenseman to play against. Maybe maybe can be replaced by somebody at the deadline, but this represents a move that Steve Yzerman wouldn't have had to make if Gudas had stayed healthy, and now we'll have to make some sort of move at the deadline.
Very true. Yeah, Radko Gudas, kind of one of those tough guys, kind of in the Igor Ulanov mode. Kind of a shot blocking guy who plays physical, plays on the puck, and not real mobile, but shutdown defenseman in his own zone. So it forces them to lean on some of their younger guys, right? It forces them to lean on a Garrison, to lean on maybe a kind of a Matt Carl more than they wanted to, maybe Suster. giving him some more minutes that he might not be ready for at this point. But really, when you look at it, they have a strong defense, but it's not an overly deep defense. And as we look, now that we're into the new year and we start to look at teams' possible trade deadline moves, you have to think that they're going to go out and get someone to kind of shore up and fill the gaps there, because even when he does come back from that injury, as they're kind of predicting the timeline for it, you never know what kind of how close to 100% he's going to be even after he does come back. So it might force Steve Yzerman's hand just to make that move and bring someone in, but he definitely has some areas of strength that he can deal from, whether it's up front with some of the surprise forwards that we've seen, or whether it's just kind of clearing out maybe one of the veterans that hasn't been producing as much as expected. He definitely has some options to work with there.
Now, Kevin, go ahead.
I would agree with the interpretation of Gudas being a real significant loss. He comes with some unpredictability. He plays on the outside edge of the rule books. He explores the interpretation of the rules, and it makes him difficult to play against. I think that sort of makes the Lightning a little more difficult to play against. So it will be hard to find someone that'll fill his role on that team, because I think he's a very unique player. I think Yzerman has really done a good job of building, a real team where they have a lot of guys playing a lot of different roles. So, it'll test Yzerman yet again. Although, as I said yesterday, it's really remarkable the job he's done in putting together this team, and he went about it the right way too. Like, some guys there, when they're done playing, they think they can step right in and run the show. He served an apprenticeship under Ken Holland, where he went out and he scouted the minor leagues. He went in, sat in on all the meetings, and he learned, what being a manager entails. And I give him a lot of props for that, because when he took the GM job, he was ready. He was ready to run at high speed, and he's really proven that. So it'll be fascinating to see. He has really succeeded in every challenge he's had. It'll be interesting to see what he can do with the loss of Gudas.
No, that's very true. That's very true. And Kevin brings up a good point. In Yzerman, I think the difference between him and some other GMs that we've seen come in, especially former players who've stepped into that role immediately, is it's almost like they expect players to be a finished product once they are acquired. And Yzerman has put the focus on development. He's put the phone's ringing. All right, but he's put the focus on developing players and getting the most out of their developing their assets, rather than bringing in guys who are already finished and expecting them to be key contributors.
Yeah, I mean, I've been very, very appreciative of Yzerman's adept nature as a GM. I think he's ended up being one of the league's better GMs. And Kevin, one of the other guys who I think has done a really good job has been Marc Bergevin in Montreal. They lost last night. They're only 2 points behind Tampa Bay, and he's shown his wiliness, if that's a word, this year with the move of Rene Bourque to Anaheim for Brian Allen. Rene Bourque just wasn't a fit there. Now they've sent Brian Allen down to the minors, but they also swapped Moen to Dallas for Sergei Gonchar, and he's helped on their blue line. But the thing is, with Montreal, and the concern I would have if I was somebody in their management, is whether they have enough goal scoring in the playoffs to succeed. We know that they have Pat Chiaretti and Galchenyuk, and PK Subban's one of the best defensemen in the league. But unlike some teams, they have the cap room to add a player at the deadline. But I think it's tough to get guys who can score goals at the deadline, as they proved last year with Thomas Vanek. So I think that's what's on the plate for Marc Bergevin.
I would agree. It was interesting. I covered Bergevin as a player, and what I would have said about him was he's one of the funniest players that I ever covered. Like, he was so glib, quick with the joke. But I think, beneath the humor, people saw that this was a very clever man and a guy that was very analytical. And he's really proven that. I mean, the Canadiens, to me, are a chemistry team. When you look at them, you're not quite sure why they're as good as they are. But I think Bergevin has done a real good job of reading his team and knowing what they need. And I agree that they need more scoring. But, the balance of that, if you're short on scoring, Bergevin has a coach who is very defensive-minded, who can compensate for that. So I think they're in a position to go out and get somebody. The big question is how many scorers are going to be available, in the marketplace. But I think the Canadiens are kind of built for the postseason. I think they can play, a good, strong defensive game with the defensemen that can control the puck and get it out of danger as well, and can get it up to their forwards. So, they're set to go. I think the pessimistic view is doing a little bit with Mears, but I think it's more with good chemistry and Bergevin kind of knowing and reading what he really has.
Yeah, and they have the flexibility, Ryan, with the cap room that they have. I don't have the cap number in front of me, but I know it's significant, that they can go out and maybe make a deal with a team like a Buffalo or a team like an Arizona that's dumping players closer to the deadline and get an Antoine Vermette or get a Chris Stewart. I mean, if that's what Bergevin thinks fits into the construct of that team, they have the ability to go out and do that. So they can add if not a top 6 guy, at least a top 9 guy that'll kick in a goal every once in a while.
Yeah, and that's one of the benefits of having kind of a forward by committee and not relying on superstars up front. I mean, they still have Carey Price and PK Subban who are making big deals, but you don't have 6-7 players who are in that $7-8 million range who are absorbing massive amounts of your cap space, right? And so it does give them the freedom to have some interchangeable parts, and really, when you look at the way that they've been able to deploy their lines this season, you don't worry about them bringing in someone at the deadline and having to worry about chemistry issues or how they'll adjust, because it's really been pretty free-flowing when you have 3 lines and you can't really label any one your first, second, or third line. And in talking to Canadiens fans, it's interesting because they're really looking forward to the playoffs, and they feel that they match up well against any team in the East just because of that depth that they have up front, a mobile defense, some good young solid players who are contributing well, and really when you look at it, what they need, their needs, it's really difficult, especially when you look at other teams that are supposed to be contenders in the Eastern Conference. I think the Canadiens, of all those teams, they don't really have any glaring needs, so it's pretty nice where you're able to just maybe patch some holes or add some complementary players without really looking for or needing to rely on difference makers here coming down the stretch.
A couple standout performances in a couple games. We had Semyon Varlamov with a 53 saves shutout against the Chicago Blackhawks, and David Backes scoring 4 goals in a 6-0 win over the Arizona Coyotes. Kevin, right now, Colorado's got 40 points. They're in the bottom of the Central Division. They're, I think, 7 or 8. I believe it's 8 points behind the second wild card team. It's a team with a lot of talent that had a great year last year, but have struggled this year. And Varlamov has had health problems. They've had to play, Pickard in goal for a number of games. If Varlamov is straightened out, if they can get him back to the way he was playing last year, do they have a chance at a second half run and making the playoffs?
Well, they're coming hard on the rail. There's no doubt about that. When you watch them play, they've gained confidence at the start of the year. And, we talked about this before. I think Waugh knew all this was coming. They had won too many one-goal games last season. They had a lot of luck in their, exceptional season. And I think now, they're restoring their confidence, and Varlamov is in the middle of that. The problem is, and it was the same thing that I said about the Columbus Blue Jackets, once you've dug yourself a hole in this league and you have too many teams to jump over, it just becomes a daunting challenge. And I think that's the same situation. They could play really, really well and be one of the better teams in the league, but it's still going to be hard for them to climb up. It's really hard to cut the distance in a 7 or an 8 point deficit. It just takes a long time because, as I've said before, if you look at it in 10-game increments, if you win 7 games, which you're playing pretty well if you win in 7 out of 10, well, if there's 5 teams in front of you, you can pretty much count on 1 or 2 of those teams winning 6 in front of you. So you're only gaining 2 points every 10 games. So it takes time. So I don't know whether the Avalanche can do it. I think the poor start doomed them. But I think they're a much different team. They're not as sharp as they were last season. They still need defensive help. And I think if there was one team that could benefit from really going out and swinging for the fences and try to get one of the available defensemen, I think they could be a team that that would certainly help their chances of sneaking back in, but I don't see it happening.
Ryan, it's ironic that Columbus last year, and they benefited from the last month collapse of the Leafs, but you need a team like the Leafs to collapse for one of these teams to have the type of second half that they need to have, and then benefit from some breaks and have somebody fall off the table. Columbus is doing the same thing this year as well. I mean, they had injuries the first 2 months. They won last night against the Dallas Stars. They've played remarkably well in the last month, but they're slowly gaining ground, and they would have to maintain at least a 600 pace to be able to make the playoffs. If you bury yourself in the first month or two, it's almost impossible to get back.
Yeah, it is very, very difficult, and you have to, the level of consistency you have to maintain is just ridiculous, right? And being able to keep it up and being able to withstand the injuries, particularly the injuries that the Blue Jackets have had to deal with, it's pretty remarkable just that they've had this stretch that they have had over the last month when you factor in all the obstacles they've had to deal with. But momentum is a funny thing, right? When teams start believing in themselves, when you start getting on a good swing, like Kevin says, the Blue Jackets now, that's a team that's won 7 of their last 10. They replicate that a couple times here. They find themselves in decent shape at the All-Star break. Who knows? Because then you look at a team who says, well, we've weathered the storm here. Maybe we add some pieces at the deadline. Maybe we're making a push for the playoffs, and we're in a situation where you have other teams that are kind of in turmoil in the Eastern Conference right now, right? Like the Maple Leafs, obviously. The Red Wings haven't been great over their last 10. You have some teams that are kind of treading water. So if they're able to take advantage and capitalize on the misfortunes of other teams, we could see, who knows, the Columbus Blue Jackets, they're not out of it by any stretch. They're still right there. They're still going to be able to stay within shouting distance, I think. And, if you can make up that ground gradually over time here, I think they have enough scoring up front. I think if they get some players back healthy here in the next month or two, who knows? They could be right there by the end of it.
No, let me illustrate my point. What I was talking about. It was about 3 weeks ago that we had the conversation about the Blue Jackets, who were starting to play well. And at that point, as I recall, I think they were 7 points back. And we've just pointed out, they went 7-2-1 in their last 10, and they are 6 points now out of a playoff spot. and the reason why they're 6 points out is the Rangers have gone 9-1 in their last 10, and the Washington Capitals, who were kind of bumping around in that borderline, they've gone 7-1-2. And then around them, Florida has gone 5-3-2, so that's 12 points, and Columbus ended up with 15 points, so they actually gained 3 on Florida on that period. So they've kind of climbed up a little, but I mean it just illustrates the point that Ryan just made of how difficult it is. The climb is, that hole. Once you fall into it, it's hard to get out of it.
Yeah, they almost have a better chance of catching one of the 2 wild cards that are currently in the Atlantic right now than any of the top 3 in their own division, because, I mean, right now, as you said, Washington and the Rangers are 2 of the hottest teams in the league. Going back to St. Louis, because I mentioned Backes' 4-goal performance against Arizona, Kevin, we've heard a lot of rumors about the Blues, and the thing is, you look at the standings. I mean, they're 5 points behind Nashville, 3 points behind Chicago, firmly entrenched in a playoff spot in the Western Conference. But we've heard Oshie's name mentioned, we've heard Berglund's name mentioned. There seems to be, even though they're having some success on the ice, some discontent in terms of how the team is playing. Is this just they need to get somebody because Ken Hitchcock is getting a little frazzled, or I mean, what is the reason there?
Well, I think it's, despite the fact that they've, overall, when you look at the place they are in the standings, it's, where they need to be. They would have liked to have won the division, but you just need to be in a playoff spot in the West, as we've said many times. And it really does come down to, and it's usually luck that decides this, of who your playoff opponent's going to be. But the real issue for the Blues is they've had a level of inconsistency that's alarming. Even in their last 10, I think. Let me look to be sure. Yeah, they're 4-5-1 in their last 10. And and in the West, you got to be better than that. You've got to concentrate on winning at least 6 out of every 10 games you play. And I think because of that, there's concern. And Backus, despite the 4 goals, hasn't been as dominant as he's been in the past. The defense hasn't been as sharp as they expected it to be. There's been periods where the offense hasn't contributed as much as they would like to. There's always been some dissatisfaction with Berglund. He's always been the subject of trade rumors. Most of Oshie's goals have come recently. They announced he had a serial on December 5th, his own serial, Oshie, and since then he's had like 8 goals in 12 games. Before then he had 2 goals in 20-some games. So because of all that, I think they look around them and they see the Predators playing better. They see the Blackhawks being the Blackhawks, and there's just concern that they're not as strong as they need to be. And so I anticipate they're a team that, if I had to list 5 teams that I think for sure are going to make a move to strengthen them, I would put the Blues on that list.
Ryan, there's a secret for Nail Yakupov. They got to give him a new cereal.
Oh, geez, get out of here.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on the Blues? Because I agree with what Kevin says. I think this team, even though they're having success right now, even though I think they're playing well, there's something amiss. And I have a feeling that Doug Armstrong is going to make some sort of move. They have a lot of pieces that they can move. They have the benefit of some young guys like Jaden Schwartz and Tarasenko and Laterra, who's not a younger guy, but he came in and he's relatively inexpensive. That these guys can take prominent roles, and they could maybe move a Berglund or an Oshie out and get themselves either a defenseman or some other forward that would help them. Do you think that that's what the Blues need to do?
Oh, that is a team. You know how everyone's looking for defensemen? No one ever has enough defensemen. I think the Blues have enough defensemen, but they don't have many good ones. And the problem is that they've put a lot of stock in Pietrangelo and Bouwmeester, who have not had good seasons at all, both with a negative plus-minus. Pietrangelo has the worst plus-minus on the team, and he's playing 25 minutes a night. So whether it's a factor that maybe he's just hit a wall in his development, or he's regressed a little bit, or they're just playing him too many minutes. I mean, when you compare his numbers and his performance just visually to Shattenkirk, who's nearly averaging a point per game, and I think he's around plus 19, 20 at the moment, it's just a dramatic difference there. And so if you look at Pietrangelo, it might be time where you say, well, where's his value going? Is it going up or is it going down? Has it stagnated? What could we get for this guy? Because if you're the Blues, who I still think need help up front, it might be worth it to move a guy who's underachieving, who the rest of the league looks at him as still being an elite defenseman. And maybe Bouwmeester as well, who is not producing at all. Like I said, negative plus-minus, and another guy who might be getting a little long in the tooth. I think his best years are behind him, where he could still bring some good value. And so for the Blues, it's kind of a bit of an identity crisis, and maybe, okay, where do we want to go with this team? Where do we want to go moving forward? Are we improving? Are we going to place ourselves among the elite teams in the Western Conference, or are we going to kind of change course and maybe move out some of these guys who are underachieving?
Well,
that's a real interesting point. Like, the decision that needs to be made, and I don't know that it needs to be made today or even at the end of the season, but at some point, is when does it become Tarasenko's team? And he's obviously becoming the dynamic star of that team, and at some point, you've got to sort of build the team around what he does. And right now, the Blues are not built around what he does. They're built around Ken Hitchcock. So I think there's decisions to be made. When you look at their roster, and Tarasenko, Steen, Schwartz, Laterra, Backus, Oshie, and Paul Stastny. It's a good team, but it doesn't strike fear into you. It's not the same as talking about the Blackhawks with Taves, Kane, Hossa. Even their younger players, like Saad, is a dangerous player. And, I think the Blues are in that situation where, Hitchcock has made that team, in my mind, better than it was. But, as we all know, he has a shelf life. And are you reaching that point where he can no longer get those players to overachieve as they have in the past? So
yeah, and just like they hoped to avoid the LA Kings in a matchup in the playoffs over the last few years, and the way the divisional structure is, they're going to face Chicago either in the first or in the second round. So they have to match up against the dynamic approach of the Blackhawks and then be able to beat them. And I know they had a 2-0 lead last year, but the Blackhawks were never out of it because St. Louis was so injured. I think that's the key, is how they match up against the Blackhawks and what they need to do or what they need to acquire to better match up against them. So we'll see what happens.
And I also think the league's read on the Blues is that they're not as good as they were even last season. And I say that because I'm in the process of sort of projecting my U.S. World Cup team for 2016, just kind of a fun column. And I've been calling around the people who know within USA Hockey and just interested parties who know a lot about the game. And, I started to look at the defense, and Shattenkirk's obviously the leading point producer among the Blues defensemen. Mm-hmm. And when I started to talk about the locks on the U.S. team, I first went in thinking, well, Shattenkirk's probably a lock. He's played pretty well this season. That's not how the hockey world sees him. They see him as having a really good season. He's been a real good offensive player for them, but they look at him as a guy that, he's probably going to be on the team, but I don't want to hand him a spot yet. That maybe he's not quite as good defensively. And when I was done with that, I said to myself, is that just a reflection of the Blues? Because Shattenkirk's had a good season. I think he's played pretty well, but. It's just interesting how the perception of the team sort of rubs off on the player sometimes, because we always think it's the other way around.
And Ryan, to your point about Pietrangelo, if Doug Armstrong wants to give his friend Dave Nonis a phone call and they want to arrange a swap of defensemen, I think that they would be amenable to a Dion Phaneuf deal or something of that nature.
Similar cap hits, right, Mike?
There you go. Almost equal cap hits. There you go. New, fresh approach. I'm sure Dion and Ken Hitchcock would get along famously.
One man's trash is another man's treasure.
Okay, so let's talk about the Boston Bruins, who have been sort of an enigmatic team this year. They've been struggling. They've had a lot of injuries. They're 1 point behind Toronto, who just fired their coach, and we'll talk about that in a second. But Charlie Jacobs, the son of Jeremy Jacobs, apparently just took over as chairman of the Boston Bruins, and in a press conference, shot some volleys across the bow of the franchise. This is a franchise that has been very successful, since they signed Zdeno Chara as an unrestricted free agent, added players like Bergeron and Lucic, Krejci. This is a team that a lot of people, including people inside the Bruins organization, think should still be a contender for the Cup, and they have not been playing like a contender for the Cup. And Jacobs insinuated that if this team doesn't make the playoffs, that big changes are in the offing. Kevin, do you think that there's a Claude Julien firing on the horizon or a big deal that's possible?
Well, it's interesting because I was watching the games last night and I heard a broadcaster, I don't even remember which game I was watching, just float that very thought, and I thought, wow, this is a team that I think has won 57 playoff games over the last 7 years. This is a team that we expect to be highly competitive. But I will say this, and I said this yesterday, but it bears repeating. I just assumed all the way through this sputtering and stumbling that they've done at the start of the season that at the end of the season they were going to be in a playoff spot. Now, they still may be there, but I'm not guaranteeing that anymore. I'm backing off. I'm pulling back my Mark Messier guarantee that they're going to be in the playoffs. And the best thing they got going for them is it's the Maple Leafs that are in front of them.
There you go.
Because they're just a dysfunctional team. But let's look at it just logically, what's happened to the Bruins since last year. They lost Jerome McGinley, and I remember everybody said, me included, you know what, that's a tough loss. That's a lot of goals. Jerome McGinley's a great guy, great character guy. But, you know, Louis Eriksson will step up and get more goals. They'll find their goals. Well, they haven't found their goals. Goal scoring has been an issue. All of a sudden, the Sagan trade, which still looked okay because Riley Smith looked okay last season. Well, Louis Eriksson has not produced like they thought he would, and Smith's production has not been as strong as it was a year ago. You know, their defense, the loss of Johnny Boychuk, I think everybody knew it was going to be bad, but I don't think people knew it was going to be this bad. I mean, it's almost like the Bruins lost their bite. You know, they lost a layer of their competitiveness. He just is a hard guy to play against. He does a lot of things. He has a big shot. He has a snarl to his game. He knows how to play the game. He knows how to play the game right. And they haven't recovered. Now, compounded by the injuries to Chara. And I think the injury to Chara, what it really did, in addition to causing issues for the team in terms of you know, how to defend without him, is it's just a reminder that you know, Father Time is tracking him, you know, and I think we've seen that this season. And suddenly the Bruins defense, Seitenberg's a year older as well. You know, it's depth. You know, they lost Andrew Ferentz before. Not that he was a top player, but he added to the depth of that defense. Now Boychuk is gone. Dougie Hamilton's you know, had a fine season, but you know, I think they needed him to be even better than he has been, and I think he's been okay. It's just you know, he's a young player, so they've had a lot of things go wrong, and I do think I think the approval ratings among fans for Peter Chiarelli is probably at an all-time low, and you know, they were pretty high for a long time because he pretty much pulled all the right levers. But right now, it looks like this is a team that's in need of a boost, and they're hampered by their cap situation. It's hard for them to make a move. So, you know, they're in a little bit of trouble, and I don't think Claude Julien is going to be fired, nor do I think that Chiarelli is going to be fired. But I do think this team is probably looking at some major changes in the offseason.
Ryan, you know, one of the things that people have to put a feather in the cap of Stan Bowman is that he's been able to, over the last few years, you know, be adaptable. You know, after they win the Cup, they lose Versteeg, they trade Buffalo, and they trade Andrew Ladd, and then they replenish and they win another Cup a few years later with basically half a different team. The Bruins here with Peter Chiarelli, I mean, you know, you have things working against you, like Kevin said, Father Time. I mean, Chara is getting older and slower, has been, you know, dogged by an injury this year. Krejci has been in and out of the lineup. I mean, Bergeron is still a great player, but maybe not as great as he was a few years ago. These players are all being, I think, beaten up by, you know, playing all these extra playoff games. It's the wear and tear is affecting them. Plus, you're not getting what they expected out of Milan Lucic. Something is wrong with him. He's just not playing the way he has in the past. And maybe it's the fact that he really doesn't have a support structure anymore. This is not the big, bad Bruins of the last few years. He's lost Sean Thornton. He's lost Johnny Boychuk. So, I mean, it's not the same construct of the team. But they really haven't done a great job at replenishing this roster and maybe spending the money in the right places.
Yeah, that's true. One of the common themes of the teams that we've been talking about, whether it's Columbus or St. Louis, has been young players coming up, stepping into roles and filling in and doing a great job doing it, right? Being able to kind of make a seamless transition where you say, wow, I didn't realize that player was as good as he is. And we haven't seen anyone do that in Boston. We haven't seen any young players come up and really grab a role, especially up front among the forwards, where you've had that same core in place for 5-6 seasons, and it just seems like it's kind of stagnant. Now, I do expect a major shakeup here with the Bruins at some point. Maybe not this season, but maybe they wait till the off season, till the draft to do it. But I still think, and this kind of goes back on what I said a few weeks ago, where I thought the Bruins were going to fall out of it. I think they make the playoffs simply because you look at their record with Krejci and without Krejci. with him in the lineup, they're winning 75% of their games. Without him in the lineup, they're losing 75% of their games. And so I think he stays healthy, he stays in there. They'll right the ship, and they'll do enough to make the postseason. But going forward, I mean, especially with Jacobs and that criticism, that's just a distraction. And anytime I hear a member of ownership or a member of management who is the son of so-and-so coming out and criticizing anything or making decisions, I always kind of, you always kind of kiss your teeth a little bit and say, does this guy really have a grasp on reality? Because whether it's the Steinbrenners or whether it's Mark Davis, son of Al Davis in Oakland, these guys come in and they just don't have the elements or the perspective that either their father had or an older relative had who kind of weathered the hard times and built the team up from scratch, right? And so I'm a little concerned for everyone in Boston when you look at kind of the sky is falling rhetoric going on out there, and you realize, yeah, things aren't as great as they have been in the past, but by no means is this team fallen on hard times and desolate or anything.
Oh, come on, the Yankees haven't skipped a beat with Hal and Hank over George. Come on.
I would say this about the Bruins. Like, to me, as long as you make the playoffs, then you're fine. That's how I look at it. I mean, it's the parity league. It's tough to make the playoffs. But if they don't make the playoffs, then I think you got to tell yourself, that changes need to be made, significant changes. Because if they got into the playoffs, would anybody be shocked if they won a couple rounds? I mean, they know how to play playoff hockey.
I was just about to say, Kevin, say the Montreal Canadiens win the Atlantic Division and finish in the first in the standings in the Eastern Conference, and they face a supposedly wounded Boston Bruins team as the second wild card. Please, do you think the Canadiens want to face Tuukka Rask and all those guys?
Yeah.
No.
All the pressures in Montreal in that situation.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I still think Claude Julien, if he's not the best bench coach in the league, he's in the top three. Like, I think he just adjusts better than anyone in the league in terms of being able to read what's happening on the ice and adjusting his lines. And Krejci has been one of the keys for them. And that's Lucic's problem as well. When he doesn't have Krejci, he just seems to be a completely different player.
Yeah, if you have Krejci and Bergeron as a 1-2 punch up the middle, then everything falls into place. And Ryan, they do have a couple young guys. The Pasternak, who played in the World Junior, is a really good young player. Seth Griffith has some talent. So, but there's been talk about them moving Gregory Campbell out for cap reasons, about trading Louis Eriksson. So the reorganization of that roster may go forth at some point before the deadline or even during the summer. So there's sort of a work in progress, but it just seems like if they fall short and don't make the playoffs, or if they take a first-round exit, that Mr. Jacobs is going to want to make some sort of major shakeup, and I don't know if that'll be beneficial for them or not, but We'll see. Let's spend the last 15 minutes of the show on Leaf Buzz, because God knows the news never stops in Leafland. Today the club announced, after relieving Randy Carlyle of his duties yesterday, that Peter Horchuk, who was hired this summer as an assistant, former interim coach of the Florida Panthers, will now be the interim coach for the remainder of the season with the Leafs. Steve Spott will stay in his position as assistant coach, and player development guy Steve Staios, former NHL defenseman Steve Staios, will move behind the bench as an assistant. It looks, Kevin, as if this is going to be, they'll keep this construct until the end of the year, and then reevaluate. And I think reevaluate means see if Mike Babcock is actually going to test the market, and then go from there.
Yeah, I mean, I actually think this is the right way to go. What the Maple Leafs are what they are right now, and as I said in my column the other day, it's not as if the people in the hockey world are sitting around saying, those Maple Leafs, if they get the right coach right now, they could win the Stanley Cup. Nobody's saying that. So if that's the case, the summer, you may even have more options than you have now. So you might as well make. I think it's the right move. And Horchuk, in my mind, is a good interim coach. He did a nice job in Florida. I was actually surprised. And obviously Dale Talon knows more than I do because Gallant has done a great job there. But I was surprised. I thought he might actually get that job last season because I thought he did do a good job. But I just got, before we came on the podcast, I just got my odds from Bovada, and they're interesting. First of all, the next NHL coach to be fired, and no surprise there, Craig Berube at 4-11, followed by Mike Yeo at 7-2 odds. And then here's the surprise, though. Dave Tippett at 4-1 in terms. I don't see Dave Tippett, if they lost the rest of every game the rest of the season, I don't think he'd get fired. Just a highly respected guy, close to Don Maloney. Everybody was talking last year that the Coyotes were afraid they were going to lose him because if he had gone to unrestricted free agency like Babcock, he would have had as many options as, say, Barry Trotz did. He's that well respected. Now, the other odds that I think are interesting too is this is the odds for the who's going to be the next Leafs permanent coach here, and I've just lost him, but let me just call him back up here. And 7-4 Vegas says that Mike Babcock will be the next Leafs coach. I don't think I'd bet that. Peter DeBoer at 3-1. That's fair money. And then Dan Bylsma, which I don't see that either, 7-2. Dallas Eakins, 5-1. Don't see that.
Yeah, I can't wait to get Ryan's comment on that one.
Yeah. I'll let him go next. Paul McLean, 7-1. Horacek, 15-2. See, I might have him up a little bit. What if he gets a lot out of Toronto? They get the playoff spot. I think I'd have him up. Steve Spott, 10-1. Todd McClellan is a 12-1 shot to be the next permanent coach. So
yeah, that's assuming a lot.
And we'll go to Ryan just for the discussion of the Dallas Eakins as a 5-1 shot.
I can guarantee you, if you're putting any money on Dallas Eakins being the next head coach of the Maple Leafs, save your money. Don't do it. Put it in mutual funds or something that's going to grow. Don't waste it, because they will not be hiring him as the head coach, I guarantee. The problem with the Leafs is, do they really expect that they're going to have some magical coach come in and fix all that ails the Toronto Maple Leafs? I just don't see it happening. There's no way. And the funniest thing of the coverage yesterday, just watching it and hearing some of the reaction, was bringing on former head coach Ron Wilson, who was allowed to tie the team and the players to a tree and bash them with a shovel one more time and say, it doesn't matter who coaches these losers. They suck. They're uncoachable. There's no leadership on the team, and really echoing a lot of what the fan base has begun to say this season. And it's unfair to Randy Carlyle, because I was talking to you a little bit about this last night, Mike, in that just as an outsider viewing the situation from afar, I always had the feeling, even early on in the season, that management was looking for an excuse to fire Carlyle. And I don't know why that is, because he's a competent coach. He got, I'm not going to say he got the absolute most out of what he had in Toronto, but I don't think anyone was expecting that team to battle for home ice advantage in the playoffs or anything like that. They're currently in a playoff spot. They're doing the best with what really they've been given. And I think the fault lies in a lack of leadership, a lack of depth up the middle, and really putting management putting their faith in some players that have failed to deliver so far. So I don't think you can really put that on the coaching, and it's going to be very interesting to see where they go from here. I don't see a dramatic improvement, even if Babcock does come in.
I mean, Ryan, I didn't agree with the firing of Carlyle. I've been a backer of Carlyle because I do think he's a good coach. It was the easiest first move for the organization. It was the sacrificial lamb that was just waiting to be slaughtered. They according to the press conference yesterday, Nona said they had debated about firing Carlyle, a couple times throughout the year. I look back at their longest losing streak was a 3-game losing streak. 3-game losing streaks happen with good teams in this league. This team is a dysfunctional group that has not been able to play any kind of semblance of defense over the last 4 or 5 years And when you have a former teammate like J.S. Giguère coming in yesterday saying that this team wants to play pond hockey and has no concept and has no interest in playing two-way hockey, that's a bigger indictment than somebody who has maybe a vested interest in slamming the team like Ron Wilson does. So, I mean, I put a lot of stock into what Giguère said, and if you look at the reaction of Phil Kessel yesterday, and the reporter that asked the question regarding Kessel. I mean, I don't know how Kessel's supposed to answer, "Are you a coach killer?" He didn't put it in those terms, but he says, "Are you difficult to coach?" And Kessel's reaction was automatically defensive. It was automatically like, "Are you blaming me for Randy being fired?" And then calls the reporter an idiot. And then today, basically, without calling the reporters idiots, he says the same thing. He's like, it's not my fault. Well, excuse me, if you're being paid $8 million, if you're the best player on this team, if you can see that this guy, when he's playing, isn't trying hard defensively, he's one of the best players in the league offensively, but when he's not buying in at the other end of the ice, yes, you're going to take a boatload of criticism. And right now, all the focus has switched from Carlisle to the players. And that's where, Kevin, that's where the focus is going to stay. It's going to be directly on Kessel and Phaneuf and these core group players, and this is now up to Shanahan and Nonis to address over the next few months.
Well, and that's where it should be placed. Just to expand on what Ryan said, when Carlisle was in Anaheim and won the Cup, what did we say about that Ducks team? It was difficult to play against. It was a very hard team to play against. They were hard on the puck. They didn't give you any space, any time. They were relentless. They were a fighting team. They were an aggressive team. They were a Brian Burke team, but Carlisle coached that team. He didn't forget what to do. If he had guys who could play like that, he would. These guys just, they don't want to play that way. And I think, Kessel is out of position. Kessel is still a valuable guy. He's a guy that most teams would love to have. He could certainly solve the offensive problems of a lot of teams. But on those teams, they don't need him to be a leader. And, he's not the type of leader that you need on this Maple Leafs team. This team needs to be harder to play against. Phaneuf is not an ideal captain either. The decision that was made earlier, to me, was an indictment on his leadership when, they didn't salute the fans. It doesn't matter what the issue was, whether he was right or wrong. He should have never been put the team in that position to face that level of criticism. Someone should have said, and if it wasn't Phaneuf, should have been someone who was strong enough to go up to Phaneuf and say, "Hey, we don't want to do this because we're just going to create a distraction." But nobody seemed to be able to do that. Well, that tells me there's a leadership vacuum there. And, that's, you got to start pointing at Kessel. And, you don't need Kessel to win the Selke, as you said yesterday. You just need him to look like he, every game as if his mission is to do whatever it takes to win. It doesn't look like that when you watch him.
No, and Ryan, the thing is, it's like, I realize that Phil Kessel doesn't like to talk to the press. It's obvious. And I realize why. Because he gets really defensive and really upset at the simplest of questions. Essentially all the Toronto media wants to hear is, yes, I take my share of the responsibility and I'll try harder. That's all they really want to hear. And he gets defensive and says, "Is it my fault?" I mean, yes, it's everybody's fault. It's Carlisle's fault. It's the assistant coach's fault. It's Nonis' fault. Shanahan's. Everybody's got a stake in this. But he, thinks that since he's a top 10 scorer in the league, that he doesn't share in the responsibility for the downfall of this team so far. And when you're paying a player $8 million, if you want him just to be a guy who scores goals, and I've heard the comparison, Phil Kessel is the Patrick Kane of Toronto. Well, Patrick Kane has Jonathan Taves and has Brad Richards and Hossa and Sharp and all these guys as a support structure. Phil Kessel doesn't have that in Toronto.
Yeah, but Phil Kessel feels justified because he's a point-per-game player. And he's saying, well, I earned my money, and he can look 3 stalls down at David Clarkson and say, I have more goals than that guy has points. Why don't you point the finger at that loser, right? And he would be justified in saying it. He doesn't say it, but if he wanted to say, look, guys, I'm a one-dimensional player. I have been my entire career. I feel fine about it. I will be my entire career. I get paid. You know, it's not my job. He's a winger. He's a scoring winger. And if he came out and said those words, I think it would take all of the heat off of him, because he would finally acknowledge, okay, you know what? Yeah, I don't really care about playing defensive hockey because it's not fun. It's harder to do. And, I'm not padding my stats by playing a 200-foot game. And so people want to continue to beat him up for that. That's fine. They can do that. They can continue to try to find a coach who will coach him up and try to get more of a two-way effort or a consistent effort out of him. That's fine. They can keep looking for that guy. But I don't think Phil Kessel is the cornerstone of the Maple Leafs' problems. I think their defense, their overall team defensive awareness, their team positioning on the blue line has been poor. And really, they're not getting enough players who are really living up to their potential. I think Bozak could do more. I think Kadri could do more. Obviously, Clarkson could do more. And you just have too many passengers on that team and not really a leader to rally around. And whether the problem there is Kessel or whether it's Phaneuf or whoever you want to blame it on, I think they need more of a stronger voice of leadership, and maybe that comes from a new coach. Who knows? We'll see.
Last thing, Kevin.
By the way, that's just a great point that Ryan made. I mean, if you're starting to rank the people who are responsible for the mess, you got to go down a little ways before you get to Kessel. You do. I mean, his job is to score goals and to produce points. And we have cast him in the leadership role, but he's not the captain of the team. He's part of the core group, so he bears some responsibility. But I completely agree with what Ryan said. It's the defensive play of this team, starting with the defense. The defense isn't good enough, in my opinion. And then it's defensive play up front. But it's the second and third and fourth lines that are primarily expected to do most of the defensive work. I mean, you expect, as you said, for Kessel to put in some form of effort. But, where would the Maple Leafs be if Kessel was not the dynamic scorer that he is? I mean, they wouldn't be where they are now.
Kessel was the poster child for the cap geek generation, Kevin. That's the thing. He's the highest paid player. He's making $8 million, so they expect him to sell out at both ends of the ice and do everything he possibly can. And it doesn't work that way. I mean, Patrick Kane is making $10 million, and he doesn't play defense either. It's just he's got, he plays on a team that is more structured defensively and can cover up for some of his mistakes. I mean,
that's right. It's just like I said yesterday. There are many teams in the league that would love to have Phil Kessel, and they would forgive all of his warts.
Oh yeah.
And he would never have to speak to the press. They wouldn't care.
And somebody said on Toronto radio yesterday, and I'll finish with this, that Phil Kessel would be the perfect Arizona Coyote because he wouldn't have to deal with anyone in the media. So maybe that's what happens. We'll see. But guys, great job today. We'll have Act Back tomorrow, and Ryan, you can answer your phone. For Kevin Allen, for Ryan Garner, this is Michael Agello of HockeyBuzz.com. Thanks for watching, and remember, without the buzz, it's just hockey.